everybody, welcome back to It's Elemental. It is Wednesday, the 15th of November, 9 p.m. New Zealand time, and tonight is the Life or Death edition. So we are going to be looking at life and death. Hey Julian, hey Vince, how are you today?
Hey, yeah, Bob. Doing good. G'day, Internet. I'm doing really well. Still alive, so that's the main thing.
And that is a very good place to start. Let's start with life, Vince. Last week we looked at the cosmic joke, and we looked at the fact that consciousness is the prima materia, and that the point of life is to entertain the gods.
Yep, we certainly did. And I think that our life, to a large extent, really is the cosmic joke. This life is part of the cosmic joke, and life is really what the gods dreamed up to entertain themselves. This particular theatre that we call life, that everyone takes so seriously. I think Bill Hicks probably had the best to say about this particular topic when he said that he was mocking other people who take it so seriously. And I found that interesting because, of course, you don't want to die. Dying's not ideal, but that people take the avoidance of death so seriously is something I've always found funny.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Everybody dies, and yet it's the worst thing that could happen to you is that you die. It is actually quite a joke.
Yeah, I think there's a huge subconscious fear with most people of death, and it's one of those things that you've either suppressed and you don't want to think about, or it's something that you do think about and it's an overwhelming fear, and it's like you say, it's the worst possible thing that could happen, and it's also inevitable. So, you know, it's great to have an opportunity to talk about this topic, you know, because, you know, there's a lot of theories out there. There's, of course, you know, so much debate between atheism and Christianity about what happens after death, but there's also other theories out there, so that's what we can, of course, explore on this show.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it seems like the Western world in general has fallen totally into the materialist idea that the death of the physical body necessarily entails the death of consciousness, which seems to be a logical belief if you already believe that the brain generates consciousness, which most materialists do, and the scientific tradition in the West certainly does. If you asked the vast majority of lecturers or professors at any Western university what happens when the physical body dies, they'll say, well, consciousness is extinguished at that point because the brain is dead and no longer able to maintain consciousness. But in elementalism, of course, the first tenet is that consciousness is the prima materia, and therefore we've got a very different approach to death, because the death of the physical body doesn't necessarily mean the death of consciousness. Well, in fact, it cannot mean the death of consciousness if consciousness is the prima materia.
Mm. So what's the meaning of life then?
The meaning of life is to entertain the gods. Thus, this life has been dreamed up in such a way where it's always difficult. Like, I know just about nobody who actually has an easy life. Pretty much everybody I know on this planet is struggling in some way or other, whether financially or emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. So there's an immense amount of suffering here. And really the point of life seems to be to, at least the minor point of life, the major point of life is, of course, to entertain the gods. The minor point of life seems to be to just survive and reproduce, which makes sense to people from a materialistic perspective. But perhaps people are thinking that it doesn't really offer any answer to the more important questions.
And I mean, in elementalism, you talk about how everyone is potentially a fragment of God and potentially a minor god or a god in their own right. And of course, you know, in the Western religious traditions, there's the idea that man is made in the image of God or the image of the Creator. So part of the meaning of life is like in a fractal sense that we co-create our own reality. So part of life is to be part of the co-creation process. It's not just one God, one creation. It's an ongoing event, and that's sort of the idea that I learned at philosophy school to do with the meaning of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, co-creation rather than something that we are participating passively in. Now, you can understand, and this is what I think we'll have to talk about a lot on this particular show, is that a lot of the common narratives about life and death are psyops, artificially generated by people who want to keep other people in submission. If you think about it, having everybody believe that their consciousness is extinguished upon the death of the physical body is the perfect narrative for getting a whole population to live in fear. And then if you can get them all to live in fear, they will be submissive, much more submissive. So you can understand why the atheist materialist narrative might have been pushed by nefarious forces specifically to weaken the people who end up believing it.
I mean, that's true. You know, fear makes people easier to control because we saw that during the pandemic. It was the fear that was driving most people to obey all of the authoritarian regulations. And the same thing's happening with the fear of death. If that is the predominant paradigm that's being taught in schools or promoted, then that creates a population living in fear permanently for their whole lives, you know. That subconscious fear that you might not realize is even there.
Right.
And a lot of people repress it. A lot of people have the subconscious fear and they just say, well, it's a natural part of life and there's nothing that can be done about it, so I'm just going to repress it and pretend that I don't have it. And then so many people do that. Like so many people, if you meet them in their day-to-day lives, they'll act really confident about what they're doing. But if you ask them about the question of death, they sort of collapse like a small child because they haven't actually thought about it and they don't really know what to do about it.
Yes.
Like, it's all good. You can really ignore the question until you actually die if you want to. We don't have to be talking about this. We could wait another 30 years until we actually die and then start thinking about it. But I think it's a great topic because, like Socrates said, you really have to make peace with death before you can properly live your life. If you're always living in fear of that one day when things are going to end, then you can't do anything right in the moment.
It's like you say that materialism is the dominant scientific paradigm, and that is promoting the idea that the brain is generating consciousness, therefore the death of the physical body and the death of the brain is the end of consciousness. And, you know, it reminds me of that comedy clip I posted on Telegram, you know, talking about how ridiculous the belief is that everything in the universe sprung out of nothing, you know, because, of course, we mentioned last week, nothing can ever come out of nothing. But this is the Big Bang Theory, essentially, in the atheist materialist framework. So he went on to say, well, I asked an atheist what happens after death, and they just said nothing. So he said, oh, so you merge with your creator.
You go back to nothingness.
And, you know,
well,
we mentioned that, you know, it's actually quite absurd to believe that everything sprang out of nothing. It's far more absurd than having a religious belief.
I think in a lot of people's case, they are so identified with their own ego and their own particular identity on this one particular earth life that they can't imagine any previous life that they may have had before it. And so they think it must have just been been nothing. If I wasn't Vince McLeod, I must have been nothing because Vince McLeod is fucking so great. And I think there's a lot of people who are on that wavelength. And so they're afraid to think, oh, maybe the time existed when I did not. In fact, I was something else. And that's unpleasant. You know, a lot of people like to think they're the main character in this universal movie.
In elementalism, the belief is that your consciousness comes back in another body at a later stage, isn't it?
Well, consciousness being the prima materia, what happens upon the death of the initial body is just that you forget the contents of consciousness that you were initially aware of. So you've got the contents of consciousness you have now. You're aware of the sensations and perceptions of the Bob Wessex body and the part of the world that you're in at the moment. But upon the death of the physical body, your fragment of consciousness will no longer be aware of those sensations and perceptions. And so your fragment of consciousness will then at some point then initially be aware of nothing, and then a new reality will manifest. Something else will enter into that void, and the contents of consciousness will become something else as per the part of the great fractal that you reincarnate into. So you might become aware of a heaven world after death. You might become aware of a hell world. You might become aware of a world very similar to this, but slightly different in some really subtle ways. Or you might become aware of anything, depending on your karmic credit or debt that you carry with your frequency of consciousness.
Of course, there's plenty of reports out there of people who have had near-death experiences, and it's common for them to feel like they leave their body and that they can then look back down and see themselves, say, in a hospital or something. So there's this idea that the spirit body leaves the physical body and then presumably is in some sort of reality which is not a physical reality, that's made up of energy and consciousness. And it could be like the great remembering, because when we're born, we forget everything that our soul knows. And then we could suddenly remember potentially all of our past lives and things like that. I mean, obviously it's speculation because we don't know for certain what happens, but in Plato's writing, there was a chapter, I think, at the end of the Republic where it's a detailed account of a vision of reincarnation, and that when people die, they go into this realm where they're essentially casting lots to see which sort of lifestyle they would have in their next life. And once these people had been allocated who their next life was going to be, they would then go back and be born as a baby again in their new life. So it was essentially not heaven or hell. It was just a neutral place where souls are reflecting on their previous life and then going into the reincarnation cycle. And I mean, of course, that is what the Hindus and other Eastern religions believe as well.
There are a lot of religious beliefs that kind of suggest that the material world is something that consciousness may have sunk into, or descended into, or fallen into, and then upon the death of the physical body, which is taken on in that material world, consciousness returns to the initial state, and that initial state may be merging with all of the other fragments of consciousness, but that may be also on a really high dimension. Maybe after the death of the physical body, it becomes a lot more like Jules said, where you just hang out with a bunch of people who you knew, or harmonious, what I like to call harmonious frequencies of consciousness. In other words, friends, essentially, friends or good family. You might incarnate in the company of those. Like, I think it's something a metaphor that I really enjoy is the one of an aliens, the guys with the big black eyes and the huge heads. And one of them just sort of wakes up and he's been smoking Salvia divinorum up in the real world, and that's caused him to hallucinate a life on Earth. And then he wakes up and says, wow, I thought I was this monkey on planet Earth and I had to pay rent to people who owned the planet, otherwise I'd die in the street, and it was insane. And I'm sure that's how something like that will be the case. If this life really is just to entertain the gods, then I expect that when we die, we'll look back on this life and think, man, that was wacky.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I will. Like, if I would die right now and go into a place of bliss where I was reunited with all of my ancestors and my own personal heroes from this life, I'd be thinking, wow, that was incredible. I was born on this island at the end of the world, just isolated from the entire rest of the human race. And I went traveling in this metal plane to see other parts of the planet. And man, imagine trying to explain that to somebody from ancient Greece. And I was saying I would talk to people on the other side of the planet through this sort of mirror, this magic mirror that could throw voices. It would be incredible. This life, we're just used to it. We only get bored because we're used to doing this all day, every day. But if you had to explain to a person who had no conception of life on Earth what your life was about, they'd be astonished, I'm sure.
It is quite extraordinary, actually. When I was in the shower earlier, I had some foaming shower gel, washing stuff, and as I rubbed it, it made a whole lot of little bubbles. The little bubbles all floated around the shower, and I thought, wow, I haven't gone wow at bubbles for a long time. But imagine God who sat around and thought that he would make bubbles with a whole lot of little rainbow. I mean, there's no reason for them. They're just pretty.
Pretty much, that's what it is. Like that's similar to the idea that Hermann Hesse expressed in the glass bead game, that God would, well, at least a being in a higher dimension would have all of these glass beads inside of which was an entire universe. And you could go into one of the glass beads and experience life in this entire universe and then come back out. I mean, if you think about it, the only real problem that a God would have over time would be boredom, because all suffering would become meaningless. I mean, once you realize that consciousness is the prima materia, then suffering really does become meaningless in the sense that, it's just part of the contents of consciousness. So it's just another yin. It's like when the sun goes behind a cloud and it gets a bit cloudy, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a tragedy that you have to really feel bad about. It's the same with other suffering. Once you realize that, it kind of gets simple. So you'd have to get born again and forget all this, such that birth really is the big end rather than death. If you think that if death causes you to be reunited with all of the other fragments of consciousness and reunited with God, then it was really birth into this material world that was the end of most of reality.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the West, we've talked about the clown world fork. It's like if you are not in the atheist mindset, then often you're going into a Christian or Judeo-Christian religion, and there's this whole concept of heaven and hell, and most people are having to choose between atheism and heaven and hell for their belief system. And of course, there's a lot of negatives about a large percentage of the population going to hell. It doesn't seem like something to look forward to. Even if you are Christian, many of your friends and loved ones could go to hell. So what's to look forward to there, And it's possible that, from the research I've done, it's possible that reincarnation was a common belief 2,000 years ago, and that it's a more recent thing to bring in this conception of just one lifetime. You still have an afterlife, of course, in the Christian tradition, but the belief is you only have one lifetime on Earth, and after that you're judged, or you're basically determined whether you're worthy of heaven.
If you think about it practically, if you had to make up a story to manipulate somebody into submission, the heaven and hell narrative is pretty much exactly what you'd come up with. You've taken the maximum possible benefit for listening to me and contrasted it with the maximum possible punishment for listening to me or for not listening to me, and then said that's the deal. If you do what I tell you, you basically have eternal bliss, and if you don't do what I tell you, you have eternal suffering. And wow, you can really see why a population that had such a belief pushed on them would live in a state of constant neurosis. It would be very much like the atheist idea that death leads to extinction. If you're in eternal fear of judgment, I mean, like that's the Clanwood Fork. Either you live in eternal fear of extinction or you live in eternal fear of the judgment of Yahweh. And you can't escape it without escaping the fork.
Yeah, and it's an interesting paradigm that the Roman Empire merged in with Christendom. So you've got those different, they previously had the pantheon of gods like Zeus and so on, and then they've replaced that with the Christian gods. But from what I was looking at, it was a Roman emperor and his wife who were pushing this idea of heaven and hell because she wanted to become a goddess and she didn't want the public believing that she was just going to reincarnate after she died. So it was this Roman empress that is potentially responsible for censoring out all the biblical mentions of reincarnation. And, I mean, of course, some people believe that the scripture hasn't been tampered with, but there's evidence of plenty of redacting and changes going on, certainly over the centuries.
I do think that religious traditions do get refined and rewritten and edited and reinterpreted as society changes. So I don't think that there's any real necessary, absolute holy book that writes everything down and it never changes. Because, I mean, even if you look through, for instance, the Bible, you can see that the narrative changes from the beginning. I mean, God gave this earth to man and woman to be their playgrounds, basically. And then things went wrong and the rules changed. And so, if that can happen in the very first story, that the rules can change, then there's no real need to hold on to one narrative. I mean, we are just humans searching after understanding. We can't really expect to know what's happening on the other side.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we've mentioned, there were Greco-Roman influences that did believe in reincarnation. So it's been there historically. It was potentially there even in biblical narratives previously. So it's an interesting debate, particularly with Christians, of course, because it's contentious. But
the more Indo-European beliefs than specifically Greco-Roman, because the Hindus still have them, as you mentioned previously. The Hindus still have essentially the same beliefs in reincarnation that white people will have had before the Christian invasion. So it's quite interesting to observe existing Hinduism and see what they currently believe. And it's very similar. Like I see them making jokes on the internet that if you do so and so, you're going to reincarnate as a dog in Mumbai or various things like this. You reincarnate as a monkey if you're slightly less bad, and I see the perceptions being thrown around. But if you assume that consciousness is the prima materia, then the idea of reincarnation, it follows naturally. In fact, it's inevitable. You can't really avoid it because consciousness dreamed up this material world in the first place. And so if the physical body dies and consciousness stopped being aware of a physical world and just was only aware of nothing, then consciousness would just dream up another world. And that's possibly, this life that we're living now could be the trillionth iteration of Earth, as far as we know. This could be the trillionth time we've tried living this life. And maybe we just have to wait until we get bored of it and then the world ends.
Well, that's right. I mean, if consciousness lives in the eternal realm, then it's possible that we are eternal beings that have been living for an unlimited amount of time, and we incarnate into different lives, basically for different experiences, and to grow from those experiences and stuff. And like you say, it could be millions, trillions of times, and it's possible, like in the elementalist conception and other theories, time is not such a linear thing. Time is happening simultaneously, both in the past and the future and the present, all at the same time. So it's possible that we can reincarnate back into the past, or reincarnate potentially even back into the same lives over and over again, and have a slightly different variation on the same life, or try and live that same life better. So, you know, it sounds far-fetched, but if you look into like the teachings of Dolores Cannon, she talks about a lot of this sort of stuff from hypnotic regression. She got all the information from people who she interviewed who were under a state of hypnosis, and they would sort of be able to speak from their subconscious mind, which could tap into all this knowledge that is stored in the collective consciousness.
Yeah, I've never done hypnotic regression, but from what I've heard, it sounds like it ought to be similar to taking a psychedelic, in the sense that you stop being aware of all the mundane details of your particular physical life, and thereby start becoming aware of deeper thoughts and deeper things. And that's how a person can come to be aware that consciousness is supreme material in the first place, if you regress far enough back into it, such that you're no longer aware of this physical reality. And that can happen by taking something like salvia or DMT or even enough mushrooms, or by all sorts of other ways, even meditation, near-death experience, hypnotic regression. Perhaps there's even going to be in the future some way of massaging brainwaves, like using that device they used to call a God helmet, because apparently it could knock out the part of the brain that was skeptical about the existence of God.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, stuff like Salvia divinorum, I mean, people might wonder how drugs are relevant to a conversation about life and death, but of course you have the concept of the ego death, which is where people, the self-ego completely dissolves and essentially merges in with the spirit reality, you know. And so with Salvia divinorum, you're essentially, you pretty much lose complete awareness of your surroundings and the physical reality, and you're in a completely different type of reality altogether. And it's, of course, the complexity of that spiritual reality could never come from a materialist framework. I mean, they say that it's just being generated by the brain, it's just a delusional hallucination, but something that complex, I don't believe, could be generated just from your own brain as a sort of an imagination thing.
The other thing is it feels more real than real. Like anyone who's taken DMT or a really high dose of mushrooms can tell you that the experience felt more real than what this did, because this is kind of a lower hell realm sort of dream, this world that we're in where there's so much suffering. The salvia thing makes me wonder if for beings in higher dimensions, if they can't just reincarnate into bodies that are already still alive. I mean, if you no longer take the materialist point of view as the framework, then it doesn't necessarily make sense that you have to be born and then grow up as a small child. It could be that you just incarnate into a really formed adult form. Like when I took salvia, for example, one time after coming down from it, I was just lying on my front lawn and I just forgot who I was. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what New Zealand was. I didn't know what Nelson was. I didn't know what the government was. I didn't know who Vince McLeod was. And I'm just there. I'm just really calm and I'm just consciousness observing my back lawn. That's what I was. And then slowly over the course of a few minutes, I remembered that I was Vince McLeod and I lived in Nelson and I was on planet Earth and blah, blah, blah. But that took a while to remember. And it made me think that if you would just forget these things about the details of your life now, you could just incarnate as somebody else and just go along with that person's life and just forget you, wouldn't
you? Yeah, it's quite remarkable, the sort of experiences that are out there. And I think if it wasn't for some of these things, then people like us, we might still be atheists, or we might be following religions and things like that. We wouldn't be necessarily, as free in our thinking and aware of all these concepts if it wasn't for these like mind manifesting substances, is what they call the psychedelos. And
a comment here from your dad's the milkman. He says there already is a mind-damaging device in the world. It's called crack and daily Big Mac consumption. Now, I agree. Something that I'd point out, I really need to labour this at length, is that not every drug is a mind-manifesting substance. Crack, for example, is not a psychedelic. You know, you can't smoke crack, and you might meet some sort of demon, but it's unlikely that if you smoke crack, you're going to get any special insights into the nature of your consciousness.
Mm. Yes, of course. Don't try anything at home unless you, under a supervised professional, of course, in a country where it's legal as well. But yeah,
and even if you do, don't smoke crack.
yeah.
Okay, so just going back to the thing that you were saying about consciousness. Consciousness is the prima materia. We are a fragment of consciousness. When we die, when this body dies, the consciousness is reincarnated in another place of the great fractal.
It's like that, except it's more that consciousness became aware of this part of the great fractal, which is our current life. And when consciousness stops being aware of it upon the death of the physical body is not actually real. That's the thing that has to be remembered. The physical body is just like in a dream. You know, you've got a physical body in a dream, but then you wake up and you're like, oh, well, that wasn't actually real. Well, that's sort of how it is. You know, you die and then you are still conscious because, of course, that's what you fundamentally are. You are not your body. And so there is no such thing as, ultimately, there's no such thing as we die, because that only really makes sense if you identify with your physical form. Because your physical form, of course, dies, but what we fundamentally are is the eternal consciousness that dreams up that form. And therefore, we don't die. We just no longer are aware of that particular body. Mm-hmm. The same way you would have been aware of other bodies in previous lives, and now you no longer are.
Yeah, I mean, there's this concept of when you die, your life flashes before your eyes. And I mean, just to finish off what I was saying about psychedelics, you know, and you might think, how's that relevant? Well, under certain substances, such as nitrous oxide, obviously don't try this at home, but you can, it's essentially like an anesthetic, right, that they use at the dentist. So it essentially makes you unconscious, but you're still aware, you're still completely awake and aware of your surroundings in the other realm, in the mental realm, I guess you would call it. And one peculiar experience is actually where you see significant moments from throughout your life in this mental realm. It's often referred to as the Akashic record. And it's not just events from your past. There's events that are already in our future that are already in the Akashic record. So it's essentially the same sort of thing as your life flashing before your eyes, but you're just catching a glimpse of it while you're still alive through these mind-altering things. So, yeah, it's interesting that, you know, things in the future are already in this Akashic record, and it brings up the idea of reverse causality or dual causality, that things in our future are affecting the past and things in the past are also affecting the future simultaneously.
That makes sense. So that accords with Buddhism. The Nos experience accords with Buddhism, because the idea in Buddhism is that you can die, but then when you die, if you're still attached to a particular material experience that you want to have, like you want to have sex with all these women, or you want to do all this coke, or you want to be the king of your country or whatever, if you're still attached to that sort of experience and you still desire to have it, then you will still manifest it again. Like if you are so attached to the idea of having sex that you want to have more, then your consciousness will manifest another life where you perhaps get that opportunity. And that's why you can say that the past really does manifest the future. I mean, that's how that NOS stuff makes sense. Because I know there could be things for me that I might desire so much that they become attracted. I attract them in a future life.
So yeah, like coming back to when we die, it's possible that we pass through this Akashic record so we can see our whole life out in front of us, and we can remember things from this lifetime and review them. And like I mentioned, Dolores Cannon, she believes that we go on to a life review where there's other souls there that talk about us to review this life, the mistakes, what went wrong, what could have been done better. But it's all just part of the experience, and you'd learn from your mistakes as well as your good times.
There was a belief that the ancient Egyptians had. It was part of the Osirian mysteries that when you died, your consciousness would manifest in the judgment world, and you would be judged by essentially your peers. And the end of the Osirian mysteries was that you learned that your heart was weighed against that of your father, and if you were a worse person than him, then your heart would weigh more heavily, and then you'd incarnate into a lower realm. But if you're a better person than him, then your heart would be lighter, and you would then reincarnate into a more heavenly realm. And that was the belief of some ancient Egyptians. And that's going way back. That's going back some 4,000 or 5,000 years. The Osirian mysteries, yeah, they're even older than the Eleusinian mysteries.
So consciousness is outside of time, isn't it?
Yes, because consciousness, being the prima materia, dreams up the illusion of time, which is, of course, only an illusion, because as per the second tenet of elementalism, the only things that exist are consciousness and the contents of consciousness. And so time is really just a part of the contents of consciousness and not something that actually exists. It's only an illusion that's created by the great fractal moving past your consciousness at a certain speed. Yeah,
well, like in this life where we're perceiving everything in a linear flow of time, but like in the example of the Akashic record, that's like zooming out on that linear dimension and going to the next dimension above that, so that you can see that entire linear timeline all in one go, essentially in a represented in a type of geometry, complex geometry mixed in with the the different elements of the life. So it really does feel like going out of a dimension, and then your consciousness is able to perceive time from outside of that temporal dimension.
Yeah, it's like this fourth dimension is really a lower dimension to any consciousness that would be in the fifth dimension, and did not have to suffer the strictures of linear time. In the same way that Flatland is a lower dimension compared to the 3D world. Don't know if any of you have either of you have read Flatland.
No, I don't.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's a great book. It's a great book. He basically talks about what the contents of consciousness would be if you were in a two-dimensional world, and it's fascinating. I mean, you think about it, that's just really how it would be also if you were in a fifth-dimensional world and you manifested here, and you weren't able to go backwards in time. You're only able to go forwards until your inevitable death. That would feel really strange. If you're used to being able to just go back and forth in time and age and become younger at will.
Yeah, Flatland's a great analogy because it's a two-dimensional surface like a flat piece of paper, but from the perspective of the creatures, they can only see like a straight line. They can't see the shapes of the two-dimensional creatures. And like females are triangles, so they're very sharp and pointy. So you have to be aware of their shapes, but all you can see is a line. But it's the same for us. We're in a three-dimensional spatial reality. We can't comprehend four dimensions of spatial, or fifth dimension if you include time. So
Yeah.
You know, outside of this, you can perceive a lot more data from a higher dimension, you know, compressed into a smaller space, essentially.
And we've got another comment here. It says, it's again from your dad's the milkman. Comment is, daily crack use is like having a string and cutting pieces off every time you do crack, and the string is your nerve cells becoming damaged to a point where it's considered brain damage. And that is true. And that's one of the major reasons why I smoke weed instead of doing any kind of amphetamine or anything that would speed up my brain, because anything that speeds up the brain is much like that comment where you're cutting bits off a piece of string and you become dumber and more retarded. That's why I am smart, because I smoke weed instead of doing crack. Yeah.
So that is an important thing, because even though you have this concept in elementalism of not being afraid of death, making friends with death, coming back and everything, you also have this idea that's sort of contained in your dad's the milkman's comment there, is that life is actually really important and you need to live it to the highest level that you can.
Yeah, well, it's possible that we were sent here to achieve certain missions and that we've forgotten what our mission is, and that, you know, if we don't work towards our goals, then, you know, we may have to redo the whole lifetime. So, you know, personally, I want to live to an old age if possible. Like, my goal is to, you know, live to at least 90. So just because I believe in life after death doesn't mean I'm in a hurry to experience it. And I believe in living life to the fullest and, you know, not wasting that opportunity.
Yeah, you know, that's a common criticism of that materialists have of just about any spiritual belief. They say, well, if you believe in an afterlife, you're really just wasting the one life you have on this world right now. And in elementalism, I would say that's not true, because in elementalism, you've got a concept of the hell realms and this particular world being such a realm in the sense that here is a realm where, because of the density of the realm, because this place is so dense and because suffering's so intense here, you can raise the frequency of your consciousness much faster than in somewhere like the heaven realms where everything's much more subtle. Because it's so dense here, it's possible to really exert more will to raise the frequency of your consciousness. And so, yeah, it could be that specifically why we were incarnated into this lower realm was to raise the frequency of our consciousness such that we might fit in somewhere better after this life. But we may have forgotten. That forgetting makes it interesting, because it means that we can choose the wrong path, which is really what the gods are watching on in the possibility of seeing. You know, if it was all inevitable that we'd all perfect ourselves in this world and return to God perfected, that would be kind of boring. But because we've got the possibility of going the wrong way, then the human story becomes more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge conflict here with between freedom and the political agendas on the planet, and there's a huge contrast between, you know, all the paradise out there in the natural world compared to all the hardships in the, you know, the essentially urbanized system. But yeah, like, the problem with the atheist conception is you think that everything is essentially meaningless, that your body just randomly came to be from a bunch of atoms mutating, and then you, therefore you don't have, you know, any moral foundation. You don't have, you only have moral relativism, you know, which can lead to ideas like social Darwinism, and that there's no consequences, there's no afterlife whatsoever, so there's no judgment for any of your actions. Of course, with reincarnation and other beliefs in the afterlife, there's the incentive, of course, to do good and live moral values, because then you will either be rewarded in heaven or you will reincarnate in, you know, in a higher frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And, the fact that we have the opportunity to be on this planet, I think, it's worth trying to make the most of it. And a lot of people go through tough times, but you can come out the other side as well.
So,
it's really interesting what you say about the moral implications of the atheist belief in death, which is that if you don't reincarnate after death, then there's essentially no punishment for anything you could do in this world. You could machine gun 500 people to death, and it wouldn't matter because your consciousness would be extinguished upon the death of your physical body, so the slate would be wiped clean. I find it interesting when atheists make a moral criticism of spiritual belief and say, well, it's immoral because it distracts you from making the most of this life. I argue the opposite.
There's also the idea that higher frequency souls incarnate on Earth to try and help other people raise their frequency. And so it could be the mission is to actually reach out to other people and help them become more enlightened and aware of this perennial philosophy and things like that. And the trouble is that people come here as light workers and they get bogged down in the negative energy and they end up struggling more than the low frequency people. So, first you have to raise your own frequency and then help other people raise their frequency, because otherwise you're stuck in the frequency of Babylon, which is essentially the frequency of fear and consumerism and that sort of thing.
And what you're saying is very interesting. It was very similar to the idea of a bodhisattva in Buddhism, the idea that your fragment of consciousness might actually escape the wheel of suffering. You might actually escape samsara, but then on the other side of samsara, you decide that you'd rather reincarnate here again, specifically to save those souls who are still struggling. And that is interesting. I think it would very much entertain the gods if all of us were bodhisattvas and we'd all come here trying to save each other and all gotten bogged down in the material world again. I think that would be very funny.
Yeah, that's right. Like in reincarnation, there's the idea of two possible outcomes. One is that after death, you reincarnate into a new body and a new life. The other possible outcome is that you transcend the cycle of reincarnation and you return to a true spiritual being. And then, from there, you could potentially choose to go back into the cycle of reincarnation. But, yeah, it's like we talked about with the cosmic joke. That would be the ultimate cosmic joke if we're all spiritual light workers all trying to save each other from the lower frequency.
Julian, you mentioned earlier what did you call it, the quantum theory of reincarnation?
Yeah, this was something I just saw on YouTube recently. It's quantum reincarnation. So I'm not sure if this example is a true story, but so just take it with a grain of salt. But in this video, the person said that they were helping someone shift houses and they were carrying a heavy object down some stairs and they slipped and this large object fell on them and crushed them to death. And then as soon as they died, they suddenly just found themselves back in their house at their kitchen table and the phone rang and it was the person asking them to come round and help them move house. So they'd essentially jumped back, like they believed that they'd actually died, but then they've essentially jumped back in time 12 hours or so and then suddenly been asked to come move the house again. And they said, well, I'll help you carry the mattress, but I'm not carrying the dresser,
It's like Groundhog Day theory.
The theory is, this is based on the idea of the multiverse, where there's multiple parallel realities, and that upon the death of the body, this theory says that the consciousness shifts into a nearby parallel reality where we're still ourselves and everything's almost the same, but it's just slightly different, like the Mandela effect, where there's just slightly different variations on this reality, and it's possible that we shift into another similar reality in the multiverse timeline. So that's
I believe it.
theory.
Yeah, I believe it because the overall scale is so epic. I find it hard to believe that you could significantly change the frequency of your consciousness just in this one life. You know, I imagine that even if you did really well, you lived just about a perfect life on this earth, you would only reincarnate in a slightly higher, you'd only have a slightly more auspicious birth in the next life, such that it was a matter of many lifetimes. If you wanted to incarnate into one of the heaven realms, it wouldn't be just getting it right here on earth. You'd have to work up to it over several hundreds or thousands or maybe even millions of lifetimes. It's so hard to know.
Yeah, and according to this story, the guy could give the other person a detailed description of the interior of their house, even though that was the first time he had been there. So he was able to give them a description of the house the second time round, even though he'd never seen it before in that reality. So, yeah, it's certainly an interesting theory. You know, the fact that we could potentially already be living in parallel realities that we're not aware of, because when we're asleep and we're dreaming, our consciousness is in a different reality and it's seemingly interacting with other people in our dreams in a different reality. So it's already, you know, the anima or the shadow is already conscious in another reality when we're asleep.
Yeah, I'm sure that my fragment of consciousness goes into one of the higher dimensions when I dream, because when I'm there, it's often a much more pleasant vibe than here on planet Earth. Here on planet Earth, it feels like the average person's in a state of despair, not only about things like the economy, but also the inevitable fact of their death, which a lot of people haven't really made peace with. That's why we say it's so important to make peace with it. Yeah, I think there's the whole society, the whole of our society in the West right now is profoundly influenced by the fact that we're all so afraid of death, or most people are so afraid of death. They're willing to do all kinds of things. And you see that with medical care given to elderly people. You've got a lot of people who are hopelessly ill, like they're terminally ill. They're going to die soon. There's nothing that anybody can do about it. But medical care is given to prolong that as long as possible, even when the net effect of doing so is only to prolong suffering. So it's really interesting. Like in America, they spend hundreds of billions every year on just prolonging the life of people who are essentially dead, the dead people walking. And all this is just because of this massive fear of death. Like they don't have that in Japan. They just die.
Yeah, well, historically, the samurais would be willing to fight to the death because they were so convinced of reincarnation.
Yeah, they were so totally convinced that as soon as you believe that it's a dishonor to get captured, then you will fight to the death on every occasion. That's what they did. Yeah, they had the Buddhist tradition, so they were totally convinced in the idea of an auspicious, you get a more auspicious death. Actually, that's not too dissimilar to what the Vikings used to believe, that if you lived gloriously enough in this particular life, you'd incarnate into Valhalla, and you'd incarnate into the company of the heroes and the gods, which is, it's again similar to what the ancient Greeks believed. And I think we do really well from promoting a belief like that, because it's much different to the despair that follows inevitably from the clown world fork.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned a topic that maybe we can talk about more next week, is the whole thing about frequency and vibration, that when you're asleep, you're in this higher frequency, higher vibration, and that the energy there is positive and loving the whole time. So the reason why we don't experience that more regularly is because to access that dimension, you have to be in tune with that positive and loving frequency, you know. And I mean, I know I struggle to always stay positive, you know, like it's very easy to get bogged down, because I mean, I'm certainly not saying that I'm some sort of spiritual guru who's already perfected everything. If anything, I struggle just as much, if not more, than other people, you know.
Yeah. It's definitely true that you get what you deserve, in the sense that you reincarnate where you deserve. And that's part of the law of assortative reincarnation in elementalism. Basically, you incarnate into a realm that matches the frequency of your consciousness. So that's why I don't feel any resentment about the fact that this world is quite shitty in a lot of ways. You know, this world really does suck, and it's honest to say so. But I don't feel any resentment about that. I don't feel like God has cursed me. I don't feel like I've had an unlucky birth, because I understand that the frequency of this world matches the frequency of my consciousness. In fact, I can remember a previous life when I was some kind of duke, and I killed somebody with a sword based on a completely false idea that this person was plotting against me. And thereby, I lowered my frequency of consciousness to that of a murderous animal, and thereby incarnated into this world. We're full of surrounded by other murderous animals. So really, I mean, the lower frequencies are just like quarantine zones for those frequencies of consciousness that the higher frequencies don't want to be around. Just like the Nelson Club. You know, you mentioned the Nelson Club. It's not going to let bums in. You know, it's not going to let bums in off the street. And it's the same logic. The higher dimensions, they wouldn't let bums like us who are, let's say, as you said, struggling. You know, that's accurate to say that we're struggling with a spiritual frequency. They wouldn't let people like us in until we are more refined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we would look pretty rough around the edges. Like you say, we would look like a homeless person to a spiritual creature, you know.
Yeah.
We would look pretty rough around the edges with all of the negativity and the anger and hatred and qualities that don't exist in the higher dimensions. You know, by design, it's like you say, there's multiple levels to go through, and you only get let in if you've got good vibes.
Yeah, but that's all part of the whole thing. You know, if you are afraid of death, then they won't let you into the higher dimensions, because if you're afraid of death, then you're liable to do something violent or bad. You know, it's fear of death that causes people to misbehave. So if you've got such a fear, then you need to really work and get over it.
Yes.
And that's hard for a lot of people to accept, because, as mentioned previously, most people are materialists, and they believe their fear of death is inevitable. You know, a lot of materialists I know will say that everybody fears death, and everybody fears it to basically the maximum possible extent. But that's only true to the extent that a person is not spiritually at peace. Mm-hmm. Like Socrates, for example, he was offered, when he was sentenced to drink the hemlock and suicide, some of his friends figured out a way that he could escape and go into exile instead. But he said, I'm going to drink the hemlock anyway and die, because I have no fear of death. In fact, I'm really curious to know what it's going to be like. Mm-hmm. So he had absolutely no fear that his death would cause him to reincarnate in hell, or would be the extinction of his consciousness. Like he was absolutely convinced that he would reincarnate somewhere else, and he just thought, well, I'm 80 years old, so it's about time I saw what that was like.
Mm.
So that's the model of a successful attitude, then, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Socrates. That's why Socrates is the father of wisdom in elementalism. He's essentially a god, because to overcome his fear of death to the extent that he did, he had to be something greater than human, is the belief.
Right.
Yeah, and it reminds me of Aldous Huxley. Of course, he wrote extensively about mescaline in the 1950s, and when he died, he took mescaline, so he was on a psychedelic trip at the moment that he died. So it would be interesting, you know, to know if what he was experiencing in the psychedelic hallucinations essentially became the same reality that he went into after death, whether that drug experience essentially was just merging in with reality.
It'd be interesting to measure the physiology as well, because, I mean, I've never died, obviously, but I imagine that from what I've observed, actually physically dying would come with an extreme amount of anxiety for the vast majority of people. It'd be interesting to measure physiologically if somebody who died was, let's say, on a massive dose of LSD or psilocybin, if their body showed the same physiological signs of stress, such as cortisol release or adrenaline release. Maybe their body would just go through real peacefully if they were on a psychedelic. It'd be hard to know.
Fascinating. Gosh, that would be so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, according
I'm sure According
to the Dharmic religions, it does. So Christianity, you sort of build up through your whole life, and by the time you're old, you hopefully you're good enough to get to heaven. But with the Dharmic religions, it all relies on what you're doing right now. So if you die while you're doing something bad, it doesn't matter how many years you've been good. So that's a really interesting thing. Like what happens to you at the moment of your death? Does your life count, or is it only the moment of your death that counts?
Yeah, well, in elementalism, it's believed that all sorts of, even your deeds from 1,000 lifetimes ago will still impact your frequency of consciousness today. But and thereby your reincarnation. But that frequency and vibrations thing, as Julian mentioned, is perhaps our topic for next week.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that your whole lifetime can influence, what happens to you, but it's also, like you say, the frequency that you get onto at the time of death could elevate your consciousness, So, and of course, in Christianity, they don't have to accumulate good works over a long life. You could go around committing sin your whole life and then just convert to Christianity just the moment before you die, and it's based only on faith. So all you have to do is believe in Jesus, and then obviously you get saved. But a lot of people wouldn't be saved at the same time in that model.
Well, Julian, I know we have to end now, but it's one of my bugbears about Christians that they say that you have to believe in Jesus. But in fact, in the Bible, it doesn't say that you have to believe in him. It just says nobody comes to the Father except through the Son. It doesn't say except through believing in the Son. It was something that the Son did that opened the door for people to go to the Father. You didn't need to believe it happened or not. It just happened.
There's a lot of contentious debate. I mean, it would be a good topic for a show as well to look at Gnostic beliefs as well, and the apocryphal scriptures, which have all been censored out of the main scriptures, of course.
Yeah.
So
That might be a good time to finish this show before we get into the Abrahamic insanity.
Absolutely. I think that was a really interesting talk. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Vince and Julian. And thanks, guys, for joining us, and for your Dad's the Milkman. Thanks for your input. It was great. And we will be back again Wednesday next week, 9 p.m., and we will be discussing vibrations.
Yeah, frequencies and vibrations. I like that suggestion from Jules. I think we do that next time.
Great. Yeah, thanks for everyone who watched and put comments out there, because we really appreciate it.
Yep. Cheers, Bob. Cheers, Jules. And cheers, Internet. Thanks for watching.